I'm Carl White. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Nano Interactive. Today I'm talking to the brilliant behavioural scientist Richard Shotton. We're covering topics such as how context impacts outcomes. So the sorts of things that we'll be talking about is the psychological biases that influence people in the decisions that they make and how that is relevant to digital marketing. It's a brilliant discussion and I really enjoyed it. Richard Shotton, renowned behavioural scientist. Thank you for joining me. You've built a career on a very simple insight that what people say they'll do and what they actually do are very different. Why is that such a persistent blind spot for marketeers?
It's absolutely a core point of behavioural science. There's a big scepticism towards what people say, and generally behavioural scientists would emphasise what people do. There's an argument from people like Timothy Wilson at the University of Virginia, and he says people are strangers to themselves. So often we don't have full introspective insight into why we do the things that we do. So if you put someone on the spot and ask them why they bought a particular lager or a pair of trainers, often what will happen is people will give you a long list of plausible answers. But because they don't know their own motivations, many of those answers are deeply misleading. So there's a real flaw with surveys and focus groups. But that begs the question, as you say, well, why are those surveys and focus groups so embedded into standard market research? And I think it's because, unfortunately, people often do what's easy. And it's very easy to send out a survey. It's very easy to recruit a group of people and get them together chatting about your product. But unfortunately, in this particular instance, what's easy and what's accurate, they're wildly different things.
And so I know that in your second book, The Illusion of Choice, you talked about 16 and a half
Yeah.
biases that influence those decisions. How do those manifest themselves in kind of real life?
The broad argument, the underlying idea in behavioural science is that people are cognitive misers. So it's this phrase that Susan Fiske at Princeton came up with. And it's a slightly complicated way of saying that people are a little bit lazy. Now, she's not trying to be rude about people. She worked at Princeton. She dealt with some of the most intelligent people in the world. But what she realises is that from an evolutionary perspective, energy is a really scarce resource. So we as humans have evolved to ration deep, considered thinking because thinking is surprisingly energy intensive. And most of our decisions are made in a quick snap, reflexive way. Now, the way that we make those quick decisions is to use what psychologists call heuristics, what you and I would just call a rule of thumb. And all of us have this giant catalogue of rules of thumb in our head that we use to make fast decisions. So going back to your point, how does behavioural science manifest itself? Well, if we're in the supermarket aisle and we're looking at shampoos, what we don't do is behave like a utility maximizer from a kind of standard economic point of view. We don't pick up every single shampoo and then think how much benefit we're going to get versus the cost. We don't do that because it would be ludicrously complex. It would take all day. What we do instead is use one of these quick rules of thumb to make a fast snap decision. We might use the rule of thumb that the most expensive one is the highest quality. Or we might use a rule of thumb that we can optimize by picking the middle one or picking the one that most other people use. We use these quick rules of thumb to make fast decisions. And for marketers, if you want to change people's behavior, if you want people to pick your product, you need to work with these rules of thumb rather than against them.
And so marketers use proxies as well. I mean, in a way, is that the same thing, kind of the heuristics kind of model where they're using demographics or, gender, age, income? These are all simplifications and rationalizations. I mean, does that have a place in the current marketing world?
They are quite, I think, different things from the heuristics. So the heuristics might be one idea that has been repeatedly proven in experiments is the idea of social proof. So it's the argument that if you can make your product look like it's popular, it becomes more appealing and more people are likely to want to buy it. So that would be a behavioural science bias. That's very well proven and a good way of influencing most people. I think what's separate to that is the proxies that marketers use. They might use demographics or attitude or life stage as a way to segment their audiences. So almost the proxy is the way of defining who your audience is, and I think there are flaws with that approach. But the heuristic is a proven way to influence those groups. So once you've chosen who you want to target, the heuristic is a way of effectively persuading that group to change its behaviour.
And we have a principle at Nano Interactive, which is kind of intent over identity. That means that the situation becomes more important than the identity of the person. Is that something that kind of fits with behavioural science?
Absolutely, and it's supported by quite a lot of experimentation. So there's a long-standing, really important idea in behavioural science and psychology called the fundamental attribution error. And it's essentially the argument that we, as a people, we overestimate the stability of other people's characteristics. We are too likely to describe how people behave based on their demographics, and we tend to underestimate the importance of the context. So if that all sounds a bit vague, there's a classic study. It's an very old study. It's a 1973 study by Batson and Darling, and it was called From Jerusalem to Jericho. And they go out and recruit a group of trainee priests, and they ask those priests a whole series of questions about why they wanted to join the priesthood. Essentially, they're trying to work out, are those people motivated by altruism, or are they more self-interested, just in their own interest in their own salvation? So they give them this battery of questions, and then they invite the priests one by one into their laboratory, and they set them a task. They say to the priests, look, here's a sermon topic. We want you to go over to the nearby church and deliver your speech. And then the real experiment starts. Some people are told, oh gosh, you're running late. You should have been there 5 minutes ago. Hurry down to the church. The other half of people are told, you've got plenty of time. They're expecting you in half an hour, but you might as well head down to the church now. So some people are essentially put in a rush. Other people are given plenty of time. The priests then set off, one by one. This is all done individually. They set off towards the church to give their sermon. And on the way, there is a colleague of the psychologists. The participants don't know that he's a colleague, but there's a colleague who is pretending to have breathing difficulties. So he slumps up against the wall, panting, clutching his chest. And the real test is who stops and helps the person in need. Now, they've got two metrics they can cut the data by. The personality data, why people joined the priesthood, and then the situational data, are they in a rush or not? And what they found was personality data made no difference in stopping rates. Whether someone was a self-proclaimed altruist or not didn't make any difference about whether they helped. What made a massive difference was whether people were in a rush. So if people were rushing, 10% of them stopped. If they had plenty of time, 63% of them stopped. This massive six-fold difference. Now, I did say at the beginning it was called the fundamental attribution error. And then the final bit of the study shows why it's called that. What the psychologists then did was go out and recruit a new group of people, and they asked them what they thought would happen in the experiment. And what's interesting is most people think the stopping rates would be determined by personality. They thought that in such a kind of serious issue, whether someone was in a rush or not wouldn't make any difference. That was the first study, really, that set psychologists off on this idea of what became known as the fundamental attribution error. This idea that we think that we should identify people by their characteristics, and we give that lots of importance. What we systematically underestimate is the importance of the situation. And I think marketers are as guilty of this as anyone. We spend all our time thinking about target audiences in terms of demographics and age, and what we should think about much, much more is target context. There's a huge amount of variation between the same person, dependent on what mood or what situation they're in.
And the ad industry loves a kind of clean metric, click-through rate, viewability. You've talked about Goodhart's law of marketing in the context of marketing. What happens when we optimize to a single signal?
So there's I think he was a former governor of the Bank of England, but it was an economist called Charles Goodhart. And he said, when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to have value as a measure. And this is a potential issue that if you simplify a complex reality into a single metric, if there is a sliver of difference between the metric and reality, which there virtually always will be, it then ends up having unintended consequences. So in the Choice Factory, I have a chapter about the Goodhart's law, and I talk about at the beginning a historical story into what became known as the Cobra effect. And it's a story of colonial India, where the governor of Delhi became concerned about the number of snake bites. So he decides that he is going to give a reward for every member of the public, a couple of rupees, if they kill a snake and bring it in. Because he thinks if everyone gets behind this mission, they can wipe out all the cobras nearby and snake bites will drop. And to begin with, it looks like an amazing success. Cobra skins pour into the colonial office. They are handing out cash left, right, and centre. But then after a while, they begin to wonder, why aren't the number of cobras declining? We've killed tens of thousands of these things, but they still seem to be coming. And what transpired was that people had taken this target, bringing a dead cobra, and interpreted it to their advantage rather than the underlying spirit of the law. What people were doing were getting cobras, breeding them, and then killing one and bringing the snake skin in. So it was having no underlying effect on the core issue. So they decide to cancel the policy, and then that just made everything worse because people released these cobras out into the wild, and now we've got more problems than at the beginning. That story, and there are some, doubts about the kind of truthfulness of that individual story, but that was the kind of archetype. And then since then, it's happened in a remarkable number of places, much better documented. So rat's tails in Hanoi, I think wild pigs in America. Again and again, if you set a target, what people tend to do is deliver against that in a very kind of literal, narrow-minded way. And all the other richness of reality that you really want to achieve but isn't captured by the target, that falls by the wayside.
So how does that work in the other direction? Because obviously one of the kind of benefits that we're seeing of AI being coming into marketing is that a lot more signal, a lot more data is being utilized. And you've done some work on confidence levels relating to that. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so the problem with, I think, a single metric is often it leads to an inadvertent unintended consequences. So, you easily can capture something like click-through, and then that leads people to overly prioritize immediate engagement over longer term, harder to measure pieces of information like brand equity. So you do have this problem with optimizing to a single bit of data. There is a slightly different issue when people collect large amounts of data, and that relates to overconfidence. So that there was a famous study done by Slovich, who was at the University of Oregon, with bookies. So these were people who were setting the odds for horse races. He recruits a group of bookies and he asked them to predict the outcome of various different races. And sometimes he gives them one bit of data, sometimes 5 bits of data, sometimes 10, sometimes 20, all the way up to 88 bits of data. And what he finds is the accuracy of prediction doesn't vary very much. It might creep up slightly with more data, but doesn't really vary much. But when he looks at their confidence in their ability to predict the outcome of the race, then you see a very clear pattern. As people get more bits of data, they become wildly confident in their abilities. They become overconfident in how well they're going to predict the outcome. So I think what happens here is with horse racing, there are some absolute key metrics, maybe like the performance of the horse over the last few races, the amount of water in the ground. There are some real core metrics that are important in predicting the outcome. And when people get too much data, sometimes they misweight each element. They don't give the best predictors the importance they deserve. They get seduced by irrelevant numbers. But that's what kind of dampens down, I think, some of the accuracy. But when it comes to overconfidence, people don't take that into account. They just think, well, I've got more information, therefore I'll come up with a better prediction. So here, the risk is if people have a phenomenal amount of information at their fingertips, it can lead to excess confidence. And then that can, of course, bring all sorts of problems.
Yeah, we have some experience of that at Nano, where we attention score. We use attention scores to for performance, and we have quite often looked at the component parts of those scores. So you will have time in view, you'll have ad clutter, you'll have a whole bunch of different metrics, and we're always trying to look at that and optimize which of these are actually making a difference, which of these scores are relevant. And I guess it's kind of, it compels us to do that and to not just throw data in, because there is a potential for that laziness using AI.
And I think that's a really interesting one, in that it's not that these experiments are fatalistic, but as you say, they suggest that there is a tendency to sometimes give too much importance to irrelevant facts. We can't just ignore them. And then secondly, to become overconfident. Now we know about that, we have to then try and push against it. So that, as you said, that constant refining of what goes into the metric, that's important. And then I think secondly, people recognizing that even when we have amazing levels of information, just to guard against overconfidence, it's one of the tendencies, I think, of marketers and in humans in general.
Yeah. And can we talk about mood? Because you've done work on mood and ad receptivity. We were talking earlier about humour and its impact on advertising receptiveness. Can you tell us how mood impacts ad receptiveness?
Absolutely. So the original work in terms of receptivity was done by Fred Bronner at the University of Amsterdam. So I think it was about 2007 or so. Lovely experiment, recruits 1,287 people and gets them all to read through a newspaper for a quarter of an hour or so. At the end of doing that, he then asked people to say what mood they're in. And he looked at mood in two ways. People could say they were kind of stressed or relaxed on I think a 5 or a 7-point scale, and then whether they were happy or sad on a similar scale. He collects that data, and then he asks people to recall as many ads as they can. And when he cuts recall data by mood, what he finds is if people were either relaxed or happy, they're about 50-ish% more likely to recall ads than if they were in a bad mood. So I think it's something like bad mood or stressed, you remembered about 35% of ads. Good mood or relaxed, you remember about 52% of ads. So he argues that when we're in a positive mood, our kind of cognitive map is opened up. We're open to external stimuli. When we are stressed, we become much more narrow focused. So he argues, if you want people to notice your ad, remember your ad, much, much better to repeat people when they're feeling positive. I then took his methodology and I repeated it. Did it on an even bigger sample, 2,035 people. And I did this with Laura McLean, I think. And we showed people a series of ads, and then we asked people what mood they're in, and then we asked them how much they liked those ads. And just as with Bronner's data, we saw this swing towards a greater liking of an ad when people were feeling positive. So it was about, I think, 62, 63% higher scores if people said they were in a good mood rather than a bad mood. So you have this evidence for Bronner that people are more receptive to ads in a good mood. Laura and I showed people like those ads more when they're in a good mood. Norbert Schwartz, an amazingly named psychologist, has showed that people are more likely to believe ads in a good mood. He makes the argument that from an evolutionary perspective, an absence of danger mitigated the need to think critically. So if we felt stressed, it was probably there was a risk out there, and therefore we should be on guard. If we're in a good mood, it showed there was no danger. We're more likely to believe what we're told. So whether it's noticing, liking, or believing, there is a lot of evidence that people are a much better audience, certainly from the marketer's perspective, if they're feeling positive or relaxed.
And there's a brilliant experiment in the Choice Factory about credit cards and spending behaviour. What does friction or the removal of it tell us about what people are really willing to do?
Friction is a really important thing from a behavioural science perspective. Interestingly, there have been two behavioural scientists who've won the Nobel Prize for Economics in the last 25 years. So Kahneman in 2002, and I think Thaler was 2017. And both of them have been asked a similar question. What is the single biggest learning from all your research? And they both say the same thing. They both say, make it easy. They both make the argument that people tend to overestimate the importance of motivation and underestimate the importance of friction in changing behaviour. So there's this big theme in behavioural science that if you want to change behaviour, before you think about encouraging or changing people's attitudes, what you want to be doing is making whatever you want to discourage a little bit harder and whatever you want to encourage a little bit easier. So that's the broad theme from behavioural science. And then in terms of experimentation, there's an idea called the pain of payment that I talk about in the Choice Factory. And the experiment I did with a couple of colleagues, I think it was Jenny Riddell, this was a few years ago, so this was when contactless cards were just coming around. And we stopped people as they were coming out of a Pret-a-Manger on Tottenham Court Road. And we said to them, how much have you just spent inside? What means of payment have you used? And then can we see your receipt? And what we found is if people had paid with contactless, they, about 50% of them could remember their spend accurately. And when they couldn't remember, they tended to underestimate their spend. Credit card paying by chip or PIN, it was something like about 2/3 could remember accurately what they paid. And then if they couldn't remember accurately, they were as likely to underestimate as overestimate. And then finally, cash, people who pay with cash, this shows the age of the experiment, most of them could remember what they spent to the penny, 75% or so could. But the people who couldn't remember accurately, they tended to overestimate their spend. So contactless, people were underestimating how much they'd spend. Cash, people were overestimating. And it seems when it comes to the act of paying, if you make something so friction-free that people don't even think about it, it seems to reduce their price sensitivity. They are more forgetful about what they've spent. If someone has to go through the act of actually handing over their hard-earned cash, physical bits of paper and physical bits of metal, then that loss to them looms much, much larger. So that experiment, what we did it probably 10 years ago, there has been a huge change in society since then. And I think from one perspective, the government are going to absolutely love the move to cashless because the more people pay with credit card, the more likely they are to pay their tax. But the danger is if you have a huge change like this across 70 million people, some people are going to end up overspending because they equate friction with kind of money that's been given over.
And in terms of predicting behavior, what actually works? If you were advising a business trying to predict what a consumer is going to do next, What would you tell them to look for?
I think firstly that it is hard. We talked about overconfidence earlier, and that is a consistent theme of experimentation. There's some amazing studies, like Ola Svensson from Sweden has shown that 88% of drivers think they are better than average. There's studies showing people think they're more good looking than average, more humorous than average. There's even an amazing study from Konstantin Sedekides, I think he's at the University of Southampton, and he goes to a young offenders institute, talks to people there, and this group who have been locked up because of their behaviour, even they think they are more moral than average. So it is a fundamental fact of human nature that we tend to be overconfident. So I think there's one aspect which is just be aware that predicting what's going to happen is a very, very tough thing, and maybe planning for multiple outcomes, or we talked before about Gary Klein's idea of running a pre-mortem. You've set up an intervention as a group. Think to yourselves, if in 2 years this has gone disastrously, why would it have failed? That is a very good way, I think, of flushing out some of the potential problems. So I'd be looking at ways of trying to puncture that overconfidence. But then maybe more helpfully, I would also be prioritising data that looks at what people have done rather than survey data or claims data. Claim data often sends us even in the wrong direction. It's much more powerful to set up simple test and control experiments. That tells us what influences people, and then I think that gives us a reasonable guide to knowing what will influence them in the future.
And AI now makes it possible to work at a kind of level of granularity that wasn't previously possible. Do you think that changes the game, or not?
So behavioural science has generally been interested in what affects people. It's generally been quite a broad brush approach. It looks at what are the tactics for influencing people on average. But there have been some kind of recent studies which have tried to be a bit more sophisticated. So we talked about social proof earlier, this idea that if you emphasise what lots of people have done, that behaviour becomes more appealing, more people are likely to do it. Now, there are so many experiments on social proof that there are some patterns that have emerged, and we do see a little bit of variation by type of person. So, for example, if you compare countries, the more collectivist a country, the more powerful social proof tends to be. If you look at age, the younger groups in society tend to be more influenced by social proof. If you look at customer type, there's a lovely experiment by Fang on restaurant menus that shows if people are new to a situation, like they've never dined at your restaurant before, they're more likely to be influenced by social proof. And there's even some kind of mood-based data, and it is only a one-off study, but there's some suggestion that if people feel nervous or scared, they're more likely to be influenced by social proof. So if you're talking about granularity, I think that's a big opportunity for behavioural science, not just identify the interventions that tend to influence people. What we really want to get to is the interventions that influence particular types of people or particular settings.
And so you feel that AI can potentially help us to pull those together, to understand, so to make those links, to make the matches. Is that what you're saying?
I think that any increase in the granularity of data, that's, I think, a big opportunity for behavioural science.
Right, I see. And your work on media environment is striking. The same message can land completely differently depending on where it appears. What's the behavioural mechanism behind that? What's happening?
I think a lot of it is people are picking up almost like on the body language of the communicator. The problem with a advertising claim is that often with woolly or vague claims, anyone can say them. Anyone can say they are high quality or trustworthy. They're too nebulous to pin down, so it allows both good and bad actors to make the same statement. So often words are discounted very heavily by the listener. And what people are trying to pick up on is the underlying confidence or belief in the advertiser. So there's a study I did a couple of years ago, and I've run this twice. The second one was done in Ireland with Red Sea and TAM, and we recruited about 2,700 people, randomised them into two groups, and we gave them a thought experiment. So we said to people, imagine you've met with your TD, which is essentially the Irish MP.
Yeah.
And this politician has said they are going to spend 10% more on speed cameras next year. How likely is it, do you think they will honour that promise? Now, the twist in the experiment was sometimes we said people had met their politician in a one-to-one meeting, so it was a private meeting. Other times we said the politician had made the claim in a public town hall meeting, there were 100 people there. What's interesting is the believability of the statement, even though it had the same, constituent parts, the same spend on speed cameras, the same person making it, there was about a 50%. No, it wasn't 50%, it wasn't that high. It was about a 35% variance in believability. So if people had made the statement, if the MP had made the statement in public, it was something like 31% of people believe the statement. If they'd made it in private, it was down to about 23, 24% people believing it. The argument here is that each group didn't have a different view on the morality of the politician. That was a fixed thing. What changed was the self-interest of the politician. If you make a claim in public, you have much more reputational risk. If you break a promise to 100 people, that could be fatally damaging. Whereas if you break a promise to a single person, there's much smaller downside. So people pick up on this idea, and what they noticed is people tend to be more honest and truthful if there's more risk to them, if they've made a statement in public. So that is a one element of the medium that can affect believability. Was this a public broadcast message or a private one-to-one message?
There's been, I think, recently with the American ambassador British ambassador in the US, where he had a meeting with some school children, I think, and he made some comments. Some believe maybe that was because he thought that they weren't really a proper audience, and so he wasn't going to be held to account with some of those comments. So I think that audience makes a difference to the outcome. If you could change one thing about how the advertising industry uses data and signals to understand consumer behaviour, what would it be?
Maybe having a more nuanced view of data. We sometimes talk about it as like a good or a bad thing, but of course it depends. Is that data that you're capturing an accurate representation of what actually influences people, or is it poorer quality and could be giving a misleading picture? I think we've got to be much more skeptical about the accuracy of information. Just because a number has been captured, it doesn't mean that is an accurate view into what influences people. Going back to our point earlier, if you ask people, what are you going to do in the future? You have captured data, but it's not that fair representation of what's actually going to happen. And I think too often we treat very different quality data as if it's of equal value.
And I wanted to just touch, before we finish, on the kind of halo effect.
Oh, yeah.
I know that you've written about the use of humour with Specsavers. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So I think there is a real opportunity for advertisers to embrace the power of humour. But unfortunately, there's some Kantar data that's tracked the use of humour back through about 30 years. And it shows in the long term, and there are short-term fluctuations, but in the long term, advertisers are much less likely to use humour than they did in the early 2000s or late 90s. That's a real problem. Firstly, because of what's known as present bias. So present bias is the argument that we are deeply influenced by what is happening to us now or in the very near future. We are much less influenced by what's going to happen to us in the medium or the long-term future. So the power of humour is that it gives, in an advert, an immediate reason for people to pay attention to the ad, to listen to the ad. They get a reward instantaneously. They are made to feel joyous. If you just talk about the benefits of your product, there's some lovely work by John Dawes that suggests 95% of people are not in market at any one moment. If you just talk about your product, you're talking about a benefit that is going to come in the long term. People discount that very, very heavily. So you've got to give people a reward in the immediate term in exchange for their attention. Now, you could say, okay, well, that's all very well and good, but humour just gets attention. If when people come to purchasing, they just think my brand's funny, that's not going to encourage them to hand over money for, a pair of glasses or a car brand. But actually, there's a whole series of experiments into what's known as the halo effect. And essentially, it's the argument that as a time-saving technique, an energy-saving technique, when people are weighing up the caliber of a brand or a person, what we probably should do logically is we should weigh up the attributes of that person independently. So if someone is good looking, we can score them very highly on that metric, but then we should take a completely independent judgment on their trustworthiness or their likability. That's what we probably should do for accuracy. But what tends to happen is, to save cognitive resources, people latch onto one standout attribute of a brand or a person. They notice whether they are very funny or they're very good looking. They take that and then they use that as a guide to all their other unrelated attributes. So if we think someone's good looking, we often overestimate their trustworthiness. We overestimate their intelligence. If a brand is funny, we assume they'll be higher quality. They'll be more trustworthy. So it's the argument that one standout characteristic often affects the viewer's rating of even unrelated attributes. So if you can be humorous, if you can be likable in a ad campaign, that won't just change the direct rating of those metrics. It will change all these unrelated characteristics too. So there is value not just in thinking, what do I want to communicate? There's value in thinking, what can I very, very effectively communicate in an ad? And communicating humour effectively is a task that people can do, whereas communicating things like trust or quality are much, much harder. Because often to communicate trust or quality directly, you have to make a claim. And because good and bad actors will both make grandiose claims about quality and trust, it's not very believable. The amazing thing about humour is you can be funny in an ad, and people will always give greater weight to what is an action rather than a claim. So I think there's three big benefits of humour. You grab attention, you change people's ratings for your other metrics, and because it's something you can actually do rather than claim in an ad, it has more impact than other routes to likability.
Well, Richard Shotton, this has been an absolutely brilliant discussion. The insights that you've brought from behavioural marketing that I think, from behavioural science into marketing, I think absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for the invite.
Thank you.